Good to see you again. Let's get started.
The JFK assassination, new light from recently declassified documents. November 22, 1963. The sun shone brightly on a chilly fall day in Dallas, Texas. Crowds had gathered along the city streets, waving American flags and holding homemade signs to welcome President John F. Kennedy. It was a crucial visit to secure political support in a divided Texas ahead of the 1964 election. Kennedy, young, charismatic, and photogenic, sat in the back of a Lincoln Continental convertible, accompanied by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, Texas Governor John Connally, and his wife Nellie. As the motorcade turned onto Elm Street at Dealey Plaza at 12:30 p.m., shots rang out. Eyewitnesses described a terrifying flurry of gunfire. The president slumped forward, a massive head wound instantly, ending his life. Governor Connally was also hit. The motorcade sped to Parkland Memorial Hospital, but within half an hour, Kennedy was declared dead. The country was stunned. Television and radio interrupted programming to announce the president's death. Schoolchildren were sent home. Grown men wept in the streets. The shock and sorrow soon turned into questions. What had just happened? Who would do such a thing? Just hours later, Dallas police arrested a 24-year-old former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald in connection with the murder of a police officer and later charged him with the president's assassination. Oswald proclaimed his innocence, claiming he was a patsy. Before he could stand trial, he was gunned down in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters on live television by Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner with murky connections. The American public had witnessed not just the murder of a president, but also the silencing of his alleged killer. The stage was set for one of the most enduring mysteries in modern history. The Warren Commission was formed just a week after the assassination. Chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren and including future President Gerald Ford and others, the commission was tasked with uncovering the truth. In its final report in 1964, it concluded that Oswald had acted alone and fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. One shot missed, one hit both Kennedy and Connally, and the third was fatal. Yet the public was not convinced. Early skepticism came from the so-called magic bullet theory, the idea that one bullet had caused 7 wounds between 2 men. The trajectory seemed impossible to many observers. Medical personnel at Parkland Hospital described a gaping wound in the back of Kennedy's head, which some thought suggested a shot from the front, not the rear. Eyewitnesses offered conflicting stories. Some said they heard shots from the infamous grassy knoll to the front right of the motorcade. Others pointed to echoes bouncing through the concrete and steel canyons of Dealey Plaza. Photographs and amateur film footage, particularly the Zapruder film, were scrutinized frame by frame. Books like Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment and films such as Oliver Stone's JFK would later fuel a firestorm of conspiracy speculation. Was it the CIA? The Mafia? Cuban exiles? Soviet agents? A coup by American hardliners? As more people questioned the official story, public confidence in government institutions eroded. Despite these suspicions, the truth remained elusive, locked away in sealed documents, protected by bureaucracy and muddied by time. In 1992, a surge of public interest in the case, partially spurred by the release of JFK, led Congress to pass the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. It mandated the collection and eventual release of all government records related to the assassination. A specific deadline was set, October 26, 2017. As that date approached, the world waited with anticipation. President Donald Trump, always aware of headline value, promised to release the files. Subject to the receipt of further information, I will be allowing the long-blocked and classified JFK files to be opened, he tweeted in October 2017. The move excited historians, journalists, and conspiracy theorists alike. On October 26th, over 2,800 documents were released by the National Archives. But in a sudden reversal, hundreds more were withheld at the last moment. Trump cited national security concerns and allowed government agencies 6 more months to justify redactions. A second release came in April 2018. More files were made public, but many remained redacted or completely classified. Some questioned whether the government would ever release the full truth. Yet, even among what was revealed, there were startling insights. details that added both clarity and complexity to the already tangled story of JFK's assassination. One of the most compelling revelations from the declassified documents was the extent to which U.S. intelligence agencies, especially the CIA, had been tracking Lee Harvey Oswald long before November 22, 1963. After leaving the Marines in 1959, Oswald defected to the Soviet Union, declaring his allegiance to communism and offering to share military secrets. He settled in Minsk, married a Russian woman named Marina, and seemed to disappear into obscurity. But in 1962, he was allowed to return to the United States under strange circumstances. The State Department even paid part of his travel expenses. Why would a supposed defector and possible traitor be allowed to return so easily? This question has haunted researchers for decades. The new files revealed that the CIA had intercepted communications regarding Oswald during his 1963 trip to Mexico City. There, Oswald visited both the Cuban and Soviet embassies, allegedly trying to secure a visa to Cuba. Surveillance photos and wiretaps caught him, or someone claiming to be him, speaking with embassy officials. A CIA memo described him as agitated, desperate, and possibly mentally unstable. In the Mexico City trip has always been one of the murkiest elements of Oswald's life. Some speculate he was trying to join a pro-Castro operation. Others suggest he was being manipulated, or even impersonated, by intelligence operatives. Regardless, his behavior was alarming. And yet, despite being known to the CIA and FBI, Oswald was not under any active surveillance when he arrived in Dallas. Perhaps the most chilling detail in the declassified files is a memo dated November 17, 1963, just 5 days before the assassination. It came from the FBI's New Orleans office and was addressed to the Secret Service. The memo warned that Lee Harvey Oswald could pose a threat to the president. According to the document, Oswald had recently been involved in a pro-Castro altercation and had drawn the attention of local law enforcement. The memo suggested that his behavior was erratic and his political beliefs radical. Yet, no increased security measures were taken. No one followed up. The motorcade route went ahead as planned. Some suggest this was incompetence. Others believe it was deliberate indifference, or worse. In retrospect, the memo stands as a glaring red flag. For some researchers, it's proof that the assassination was not simply an act of random violence, but one surrounded by neglect, manipulation, and possibly premeditated malfeasance by individuals within the very agencies meant to protect the president. The possibility that U.S. intelligence had foreknowledge of Oswald's threat and failed to act remains one of the most contentious issues raised by the declassified documents. While defenders of the official record argue that intelligence agencies receive hundreds of such tips and cannot act on all of them, critics point out that Oswald had a history too unusual to ignore. He was a former defector to the Soviet Union, had expressed support for Cuba during a time of intense U.S.-Cuban hostility, and had made alarming statements about his willingness to take radical action. That these red flags were overlooked, or worse, deliberately ignored, has fueled conspiracy theories for decades. The new documents also offer insight into how foreign governments reacted to the assassination. Intelligence cables from the time reveal that leaders in the Soviet Union initially suspected that a right-wing faction inside the United States had orchestrated a coup. Soviet officials, reportedly panicked, believed that Kennedy's murder could be a pretext for launching an aggressive war against the USSR. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev is quoted in one document as saying, "Now they will put in a man who will finish us off." The Soviets, according to the CIA, feared that Lyndon B. Johnson represented a more aggressive military posture and that the assassination could escalate Cold War tensions into outright conflict. Meanwhile, Cuban officials reacted with their own set of fears. According to CIA intercepts, Fidel Castro worried that Cuba might be blamed for the murder. Oswald's known pro-Cuban sympathies and his visits to Cuban diplomatic offices in Mexico City fueled those concerns. The documents suggest that Castro ordered a complete lockdown of Cuban intelligence communications in the days following the assassination, fearing U.S. retaliation. He needn't have worried, at least not immediately. The Johnson administration, while suspicious of Cuban involvement, chose not to escalate. But the incident reinforced Washington's belief that Castro remained a serious and unpredictable threat. Another thread within the declassified files centers around U.S.-based anti-Castro Cuban operatives. These exiles, many of whom were trained and funded by the CIA during the early 1960s, had deep resentment toward Kennedy for his perceived betrayal during the Bay of Pigs invasion. The failed operation in 1961, which aimed to overthrow Castro, had left hundreds of fighters imprisoned and many embittered. Some of these operatives reportedly blamed Kennedy for the lack of air support that led to the mission's failure and saw him as an obstacle to freeing their homeland. According to one FBI report, a source inside the anti-Castro community claimed to have overheard plans of violence against the president. The report was not corroborated and remained classified for decades. In the context of Oswald's movements and the known overlap between his timeline and certain exile groups, the document takes on a renewed sense of urgency. Could Oswald have been manipulated or even recruited by individuals within this network? The files do not provide conclusive answers, but the implications are deeply unsettling. Other documents reveal the extent to which the CIA and FBI infiltrated and monitored domestic political groups throughout the early 1960s. Some of these groups, like the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which Oswald was briefly affiliated with, were subject to extensive surveillance. The FBI maintained dossiers on leftist organizers, civil rights leaders, and even members of Congress. While this isn't directly tied to the assassination, it paints a picture of a government deeply engaged in secret domestic operations, raising further questions about who knew what and when. One file describes a meeting in early 1963 between CIA officials and a group of journalists. The purpose? To manage media narratives and ensure that sensitive information did not reach the public. Although this was framed as national security, it also highlights the government's interest in controlling the flow of information. When Oswald was killed before he could testify, the government had even more reason to shape a narrative that would reassure the public and prevent broader scrutiny. As information trickled out over the years, and especially after the release of these documents, a disturbing theme emerged. The story of the JFK assassination is also a story of missed opportunities, hidden agendas, and a profound distrust of transparency. While it's clear that Oswald pulled the trigger, at least according to all available forensic evidence, it's less clear that he did so alone or without encouragement. The psychological profile of Oswald that emerges from the files is complex. He was intelligent, prone to grandiosity, and intensely political. He had been under psychiatric observation as a child and had a history of domestic violence. Several documents suggest that he craved recognition and may have seen himself as a revolutionary. Whether he was acting out a personal fantasy, being manipulated by others, or part of a larger plan remains an open question. But what is clear is that Oswald was far from an unknown figure. His name appeared in CIA files, FBI alerts, and even State Department records. He was not a ghost. He was on the radar. The files also touch on Jack Ruby, the man who killed Oswald in police custody. Ruby had long been rumored to have ties to organized crime, and the newly released documents lend some weight to those claims. One memo details Ruby's alleged connections to Mafia figures in Chicago and New Orleans. Another file suggests that Ruby had been an informant for the FBI, a claim the Bureau has officially denied. If true, this opens up another layer of suspicion. Did Ruby silence Oswald to protect someone else? Or was he, like Oswald, a man with a murky past and impulsive nature, acting alone? Questions persist about the role of the Secret Service on that day in Dallas. Despite prior warnings and the known volatility of the political climate in Texas, their security protocols appear to have been shockingly lax. The newly released documents reveal that several agents expressed frustration afterward at being underprepared and misinformed. One agent wrote in a memo that critical intelligence was not passed down the chain, while another blamed regional leadership for failing to coordinate with local law enforcement. These admissions, buried in bureaucratic language, hint at an agency overwhelmed by its responsibilities. Even today, thousands of pages remain classified. When President Joe Biden took office, there was renewed hope that the full release might finally occur. But in 2021 and again in 2022, his administration extended the deadline, citing continued national security concerns. Critics argue that this excuse has worn thin. After more than 6 decades, what could possibly be so sensitive that it must remain secret? Some believe the withheld documents contain details of CIA operations unrelated to the assassination, but potentially damaging if exposed, such as illegal domestic surveillance, assassination plots abroad, or collaborations with criminal organizations. Others think the real fear lies in undermining public trust. If the full truth about the Kennedy assassination ever came out, it might confirm suspicions that elements within the U.S. government failed, through incompetence, negligence, or complicity, to prevent a national tragedy. More than anything, the story told by these documents is one of complexity. It doesn't offer a neat answer. There is no smoking gun, no definitive proof of a grand conspiracy. But the puzzle pieces suggest a larger picture, one where truth and secrecy, power and fear, and fact and fiction all collide in a tangle of motivations. For many Americans, the assassination of John F. Kennedy marked the end of an age of innocence. The revelations from the declassified files do not restore that innocence, but they do illuminate the dark corners of a moment that forever changed the course of American history. Each new page offers more insight, but also more questions. The real story of JFK's assassination may never be fully known. But what these documents reveal is that it was not just the death of a president. It was a fracture in the nation's consciousness, a moment that opened a Pandora's box of doubts, fears, and shadows that stretch all the way into our present. In the years following the assassination, public fascination with the case only deepened. A growing number of independent researchers, journalists, and whistleblowers began combing through government documents, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence. Their work, often dismissed by mainstream outlets, gradually gained traction. Each discovery, each discrepancy, each curious omission added fuel to the fire. One area that received renewed attention after the 2017 and 2018 releases was the role of intelligence assets operating inside the United States. The documents showed that the CIA had established an extensive domestic surveillance program during the Cold War, despite its official charter prohibiting such activities. It operated through liaison relationships with other federal agencies, including the FBI, and through the use of private citizens, business leaders, and journalists as informants. A particular document that drew attention described a CIA program called Tlingwell, which intercepted and opened the mail of U.S. citizens, including Oswald. The file showed that Oswald's correspondence with leftist and Soviet organizations was known to intelligence services long before the assassination. Yet, there appeared to be no coordinated effort to intervene or monitor him more closely. This raises a central and uncomfortable question. Was Oswald ignored because he was considered harmless, or was he allowed to proceed for reasons yet unknown? Another file described a mysterious individual known as the Mexico City Mystery Man, someone who identified himself as Oswald at the Cuban and Soviet embassies but did not match Oswald's appearance. Intelligence officials quietly debated the implications. Was someone impersonating Oswald to frame him or test embassy security? Was the CIA aware of this deception at the time? The memo concluded that a photo supposedly of Oswald outside the embassy could not have been him, but this information was never made public until decades later. Adding to the intrigue was a set of communications between the CIA and the Warren Commission. In one declassified exchange, a CIA official warned the commission against probing too deeply into Oswald's contacts in Mexico City, suggesting that it could expose sensitive operations. This begs the question, was the Warren Commission misled or even manipulated by the very agencies it relied on for facts? The possibility that Oswald had contact with intelligence operatives or cutouts, third-party go-betweens, remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. Some theories suggest that Oswald may have been used as a dangle, a person used to lure or test foreign intelligence agencies. Others argue that he was a low-level informant, reporting on left-wing groups under FBI guidance. The FBI has denied this, but documents hint at informal ties. Further muddying the waters are reports from informants within organized crime. Several declassified FBI memos include statements from Mafia associates who claimed that leaders within the underworld were enraged by Kennedy's crackdown on organized crime, especially by his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. The most commonly named figure is New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello, who reportedly made threats against the president and may have had links to Jack Ruby. Marcello was known to harbor a grudge against the Kennedy administration, especially after he was deported to Guatemala in 1961 under Bobby Kennedy's direct order, only to sneak back into the country. An informant claimed that Marcello once said, "The dog will keep biting you if you only cut off its tail, but if you cut off the head, it stops." Whether these statements were bluster or something more remains unknown. Yet another informant reported that Mafia Don Santo Trafficani, who had deep ties to Cuba and had worked with the CIA during attempts to assassinate Castro, made a cryptic remark before Kennedy's death: "He is going to be hit." Though these reports never led to formal charges, they demonstrate the depth of hostility toward the Kennedy administration in underworld circles. The intertwining of the Mafia, Cuban exiles, and the intelligence community during the Cold War created a murky network in which loyalties were fluid and goals sometimes aligned. The CIA's own plots to assassinate Castro, revealed during the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s, involved mob figures such as Trafficani and Chicago's Sam Giancana. If these men were capable of working with the CIA to kill a foreign leader, it is not hard to imagine them turning their attention to Kennedy if they felt betrayed. Among the most explosive revelations in the newly declassified files is the confirmation of CIA programs designed to influence or suppress media reporting. One such effort, called Operation Mockingbird, sought to use journalists, both witting and unwitting, to promote CIA narratives or discredit adversarial voices. Internal memos show concerns about negative press following Kennedy's death and a coordinated effort to push the lone gunman theory and discredit alternative explanations. This media management, combined with the government's refusal to release key documents for decades, created a lasting sense of suspicion that the truth was being actively suppressed. Even credible journalists and scholars who sought to explore inconsistencies were often branded as conspiracy theorists, a term that, according to a 1967 CIA memo, was encouraged as a tool to discredit critics of the Warren Report. The American public, once willing to accept official explanations, grew increasingly cynical. Polls conducted over the decades consistently showed that a majority of Americans believed there was more to the story than what the government told them. For many, the assassination was the beginning of a long erosion of trust in the presidency, in institutions, and in the very notion of objective truth. As more files have been released, a pattern has emerged. While no single document offers definitive proof of a conspiracy, the accumulation of oddities, contradictions, and overlooked details suggests that the full picture remains incomplete. The official narrative, though backed by extensive investigation, simply does not account for all the facts. There are those who still insist that Oswald acted alone and that the subsequent confusion was the natural result of a chaotic event. But others argue that the inconsistencies themselves point to something deeper, a struggle within the U.S. government, perhaps even between rival factions, at a time of immense global tension and domestic unrest. The Kennedy assassination, in this light, becomes more than a singular tragedy. It becomes a prism through which to view the complex and often hidden workings of American power. The Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the rise of television, the deepening role of intelligence agencies in everyday life, all intersected at that moment in Dealey Plaza. As the 21st century progresses, the drive for transparency continues. Advocacy groups, historians, and even some politicians have called for a full release of all remaining JFK records. Their argument is simple. After more than 60 years, the public has a right to know. The continued withholding of documents only deepens suspicion and prevents closure. In 2022, President Biden issued a memo stating that agencies must review all redacted information and justify why it should remain classified. Some additional files were released later that year, but significant portions remain sealed. Critics say the reasons given, national security, protection of sources and methods, are no longer credible. What is left to protect, they ask, other than reputations? The assassination of John F. Kennedy was not just an attack on a man, but on an ideal. It was the moment when American exceptionalism was shaken, when the belief in a transparent, just, and accountable government began to fray. The declassified documents, while not solving the mystery, serve as a window into a hidden history, one shaped by secrecy, fear, and the often blurred line between democracy and power. And the search for answers continues. Even as the years turned into decades, the impact of November 22, 1963, continued to ripple through American society. New generations discovered the case not just as a historical event, but as a riddle embedded within the DNA of modern political life. With every passing year, more pieces fell into place, but still, the picture remained incomplete. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, formed in 1976, was one of the most comprehensive attempts to revisit the case. It concluded in 1979 that there was a probable conspiracy in President Kennedy's murder, directly contradicting the Warren Commission's lone gunman conclusion. The basis for this finding was an acoustic analysis of a police recording from Dealey Plaza, which some experts believe captured multiple gunshots from different directions. Though later challenged by other analysts, the HSCA's conclusion marked a turning point. The U.S. government had, for the first time, officially acknowledged the likelihood of a conspiracy. Despite this, the HSCA's work was hampered by limited access to CIA and FBI records. Many of the documents that have come to light only in recent years were not available to the committee, raising the possibility that their conclusions, had they had the full picture, might have gone even further. Declassified documents from the 2017 to 2018 releases confirmed that the intelligence community was deeply concerned about the HSCA's direction and actively sought to control the flow of information. One memo from 1978 reveals that CIA leadership instructed staff to minimize exposure and avoid unintentional disclosures during interactions with the committee. Internal documents show that several witnesses were coached or had their testimonies pre-cleared. The result was a process that appeared transparent to the public but was tightly managed behind the scenes. This pattern of obfuscation, redaction, and manipulation has done little to reassure those seeking the truth. Instead, it reinforced the perception that something was being hidden, not necessarily a grand conspiracy involving dozens of individuals, but perhaps a smaller, more insidious one involving errors, cover-ups, and institutional self-preservation. Among the most compelling themes to emerge from the released files is the idea that Oswald may have been under surveillance not only in the weeks before the assassination, but long before he ever returned to the United States. After defecting to the Soviet Union in 1959, he lived in Minsk, where he was monitored by the KGB. Several documents suggest the CIA had a deep interest in his defection, tracking his movements and possibly using him as a test case for understanding Soviet intelligence operations. When Oswald returned to the U.S. in 1962 with his Russian wife, Marina, it raised eyebrows. In an era when Cold War defectors were viewed with intense suspicion, Oswald seemed to face few consequences. He was not arrested, detained, or seriously interrogated. Instead, he was allowed to settle quietly in Texas. Some of the newly declassified documents contain handwritten notes and internal memos expressing confusion among federal agents as to why Oswald hadn't been more thoroughly investigated upon his return. This has led some researchers to theorize that Oswald may have been part of a false defector program, a person sent into Soviet territory under the pretense of defection, but actually working under U.S. direction or observation. If true, it would explain why intelligence agencies were reluctant to highlight their prior contact with him. Admitting any connection, no matter how tangential, would expose a sensitive intelligence operation. Another curious discovery in the files is the extent to which key witnesses and informants met suspicious ends. David Ferry, a former associate of Oswald and alleged intermediary for anti-Castro groups, died in 1967 under what were officially ruled natural causes, but only days after being subpoenaed by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. Ferry had told friends he feared for his life. Likewise, George de Mohrenschildt, a Russian émigré who befriended Oswald in Texas and possibly served as his handler, died from a gunshot wound in 1977, just before he was scheduled to testify before the HSCA. The files suggest that both men had connections to intelligence circles. Ferry had worked with Cuban exiles and reportedly performed freelance work for the CIA. De Mohrenschildt had traveled extensively, maintained contact with CIA officers, and was considered suspicious by both American and foreign intelligence services. The nature of his relationship with Oswald remains one of the case's most enduring mysteries. One document from the Declassified collection contains a note from de Mohrenschildt in which he writes, cryptically, Oswald was a patsy. They knew it. He didn't. Whether this was a reference to a broader conspiracy or merely the musings of a troubled man will likely never be known. But it adds another layer of ambiguity to an already enigmatic story. As more attention turned to the events in Mexico City, new theories gained traction. One posits that Oswald, or someone impersonating him, was involved in a false flag operation designed to link Cuba or the Soviet Union to the assassination. If successful, such a link could have justified military retaliation or a broader crackdown. Though this theory remains speculative, the documents confirm that multiple intelligence agencies were operating in Mexico at the time, often without clear coordination. It was a hotbed of espionage, overlapping interests, and backchannel diplomacy. An internal CIA memo, dated just weeks before the assassination, notes that intelligence assets report increased chatter related to U.S. political leadership and potential threats from international actors. The memo was heavily redacted, but its timing, and the fact that it was only released in 2018, raises eyebrows. One especially startling revelation concerns a 1962 plan called Operation Northwoods, uncovered decades earlier but reaffirmed in context by the newly declassified materials. Proposed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the plan involved staging terrorist attacks on U.S. soil and blaming them on Cuba as a pretext for invasion. Though it was never implemented and was rejected by Kennedy, its mere existence demonstrates the extent to which deception was considered a legitimate tool of policy. The relevance to the JFK assassination is indirect but chilling. If such plans were seriously discussed at the highest levels, then it is not inconceivable that elements within the intelligence or military apparatus could have viewed Kennedy, who was increasingly skeptical of military intervention and backchannel intelligence work, as a threat to be neutralized. In this context, even mundane decisions take on a darker hue. Kennedy's refusal to escalate in Laos and Vietnam, his pursuit of détente with Khrushchev, and his efforts to curtail CIA autonomy were not just policy moves. They were challenges to deeply entrenched power structures. And those structures, history has shown, do not take kindly to being challenged. As the modern-day researcher sifts through these files, the task is daunting. There are thousands of pages, many still redacted or poorly scanned, filled with technical jargon, code names, and bureaucratic language. But piece by piece, a narrative emerges, not of a single, clear-cut conspiracy, but of a government overwhelmed by its own secrets, struggling to manage competing agendas, and ultimately choosing silence over scandal. The Kennedy assassination may never be solved to everyone's satisfaction, but the continued release of documents, however incomplete, pushes the story forward, forcing a confrontation with the deeper questions it raises. Who wields power in a democracy? How much should the public know? And what is the cost of truth delayed? One by one, the myths are giving way to hard facts. But even now, the heart of the mystery remains untouched. A man died in Dallas. A country changed forever. And in the silence that followed the gunshots, history was rewritten, not by what we knew, but by what we were never told. The veil of mystery over the JFK assassination has been lifted only in fragments. Each newly declassified file is like a puzzle piece, sometimes confusing on its own, sometimes deeply revealing, but never enough to complete the full picture. And among the most compelling fragments to emerge in the last decade is the growing acknowledgement of internal conflicts within the U.S. government at the time of Kennedy's presidency. Kennedy's relationship with his national security apparatus had soured dramatically by the early 1960s. After the Bay of Pigs debacle in 1961, an ill-fated CIA-led invasion of Cuba that ended in embarrassment, Kennedy reportedly felt betrayed by the intelligence community. He fired CIA Director Allen Dulles, along with senior officials Charles Cabell and Richard Bissell, and began publicly questioning the agency's power. In private, he was even more blunt. "I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds," he told a New York Times journalist. This quote, buried for years in obscure biographies and government transcripts, gained renewed attention after its confirmation in declassified internal memos. Some documents suggest that Kennedy's determination to reshape or rein in intelligence agencies was not taken lightly. One internal CIA document from 1963, written just weeks before the assassination, laments the reduction in operational autonomy and warns that continued oversight from the White House could jeopardize essential counterintelligence efforts. Historians now debate the full extent of the animosity between Kennedy and his intelligence chiefs. Some argue that he was simply demanding accountability, while others suggest he was threatening long-standing programs and covert operations that had become semi-autonomous from presidential control. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but the tension was real and the stakes were high. At the same time, Kennedy was dealing with intense pressure from military leaders who believed he was not aggressive enough against communist threats abroad. His handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, while seen by many as a triumph of diplomacy, left some within the Pentagon dissatisfied. The president had rejected calls for airstrikes and a full invasion, instead negotiating with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Documents from the Pentagon released in recent years show that several top brass considered Kennedy's approach weak and potentially dangerous. One note, scribbled in the margin of a Defense Department memo just days after the crisis, reads, "This president may not have the stomach for victory." Whether this was idle frustration or something more is hard to say, but it does reflect the growing divide between Kennedy and elements of his own military leadership. This divide extended to Vietnam, where Kennedy was increasingly skeptical of deeper U.S. involvement. Just a month before his death, he authorized National Security Action Memorandum 263, which called for the withdrawal of 1,000 American advisors from Vietnam by the end of 1963. Though modest, the decision was symbolic and deeply unpopular among Cold War hawks who saw Vietnam as the next great battleground. Within weeks of Kennedy's assassination, his successor Lyndon B. Johnson reversed this policy, signing NSM 273, which laid the groundwork for full-scale escalation. The contrast is stark and has fueled speculation that Kennedy's removal cleared the way for a more aggressive foreign policy aligned with military-industrial interests. In this light, the assassination begins to resemble less a rogue act and more an inflection point. A coup not in the traditional sense, but in the quiet reassertion of power by the permanent government, the so-called deep state, that persists beyond any single administration. But while such theories remain controversial, even radical, the declassified documents add circumstantial weight. They reveal patterns of surveillance, manipulation, and propaganda that were once dismissed as the stuff of fiction. Take, for instance, the case of Jack Ruby. Officially, Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with alleged ties to organized crime, acted spontaneously when he shot Oswald on live television just 2 days after the assassination. But multiple files now suggest a different story. One newly released FBI memo reveals that Ruby visited the offices of a known Mafia associate in New Orleans 2 weeks before Kennedy's death. Another document, previously withheld under national security exemptions, includes an informant report that Ruby claimed he was ordered to silence Oswald, and that big people were behind it. Though the authenticity of these reports is still debated, their presence in the official archive is undeniable and deeply troubling. Even more disturbing is the treatment of witnesses whose testimonies did not align with the official narrative. Numerous individuals in Dealey Plaza that day reported hearing shots from the grassy knoll, a small hill ahead, and to the right of the president's motorcade, opposite the Texas School Book Depository. Among them was Jean Hill, who famously said she saw a man run from the knoll and jump into a waiting car. Her account, along with others, was either downplayed or excluded entirely from the Warren report. Declassified FBI memos now show that agents were instructed to re-interview certain witnesses and discourage speculative commentary. In effect, the investigation was steered toward a predetermined conclusion that Oswald acted alone. This is not to say that every dissenting voice was correct or that every conspiracy theory holds water, but the pattern of omission and manipulation is clear. When the truth becomes inconvenient, it is buried. When facts conflict with policy, they are redacted. And perhaps most damning of all is the way in which the assassination was immediately used to justify policy shifts. Within days, Johnson had secured congressional support for legislation Kennedy had struggled to pass. He ramped up commitments in Vietnam, re-engaged aggressively with defense contractors, and restored full confidence in the national security state. To some, this was simply the efficient continuity of government. To others, it was opportunism at best and complicity at worst. Even the physical evidence of the assassination remains mired in doubt. The so-called magic bullet theory, the idea that a single projectile caused 7 separate wounds to both Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally, has been debunked by numerous ballistic experts. Yet it remains a pillar of the lone gunman theory. New forensic analysis, aided by technology unavailable in the 1960s, has challenged core conclusions of the Warren Report. 3D modeling of Dealey Plaza, high-resolution scans of the Zapruder film, and digital acoustic studies all suggest a more complex scenario than originally claimed. While not definitive proof of a second shooter, they strongly indicate that the Warren Commission's findings were based on flawed assumptions and limited technology. And then there is the matter of the missing files. Despite the 1992 JFK Records Act mandating full disclosure by 2017, thousands of pages remain classified. Both the Trump and Biden administrations have extended the deadline, citing vague concerns about national security and protection of intelligence methods. This continued secrecy, more than any single document, fuels the belief that there is something still worth hiding. What national security concern, critics ask, could possibly still exist more than 60 years after the fact? In the end, the JFK assassination is not just about one man's death. It is about the life of a nation, how it processes trauma, confronts power, and navigates truth. The story is not frozen in 1963. It is alive in every debate about government transparency, every challenge to institutional authority, every question of who controls the narrative. And until the last file is released and the last lie exposed, the case will remain open, not only in archives and courtrooms, but in the American conscience. As the shadow of the Kennedy assassination stretched across the decades, a subtle transformation took place. What had begun as a national tragedy slowly evolved into a cultural cornerstone of skepticism, a moment that shattered the idea of simple truths in American public life. By the 21st century, belief in the lone gunman theory had dwindled to a minority position, despite it being the government's official stance. Polls over the years showed that the majority of Americans believed in a conspiracy. But that belief wasn't monolithic. It fractured into thousands of theories, each competing for plausibility, each attempting to explain the inexplicable. The Mafia, the CIA, the FBI, anti-Castro Cubans, pro-Castro Cubans, LBJ, the military-industrial complex, a rogue cabal, a mix of two or more. The theories proliferated because the official story no longer provided satisfying answers. What the newly declassified files did, more than anything, was narrow the margins of speculation. Some paths, long ridiculed or ignored, gained new credibility. Others were rendered unlikely or discredited entirely. And through it all, a more nuanced picture emerged, not of a single orchestrated plot by one group, but of overlapping interests, crossed wires, and covert agendas that may have collided in a perfect storm. One striking element found across the files is how often key individuals' paths crossed in strange, seemingly coincidental ways. Take, for example, Clay Shaw, an affluent New Orleans businessman who became the only person ever tried for involvement in the assassination. District Attorney Jim Garrison charged Shaw in 1967, claiming he was part of a conspiracy involving David Ferrie and others. Shaw was acquitted, and the trial was widely mocked at the time. But documents later revealed that Shaw had indeed worked as a part-time contact for the CIA's Domestic Contact Division, something he denied under oath. The revelation didn't prove Garrison's broader theory, but it cast doubt on the supposed innocence of Shaw's associations. Other files linked Shaw indirectly to CIA figures operating in Latin America, particularly those involved in anti-Castro operations. Then there's Howard Hunt, a CIA officer who would later become infamous for his role in the Watergate scandal. Before Watergate, however, Hunt was allegedly in Dallas on the day of the assassination, a claim he denied but which was made by multiple sources, including his own son in later years. Hunt's name also appeared in CIA memos and communications around the period of the assassination, especially those dealing with operations in Cuba. In 2007, shortly before his death, Hunt recorded a series of confessional audio tapes, released by his son, in which he suggested that his colleagues at the CIA may have been involved in a quasi-governmental conspiracy to kill Kennedy. Though vague and lacking direct evidence, the tapes were chilling, particularly as they echoed sentiments expressed by other intelligence veterans in off-the-record interviews. One of the most unnerving realizations is that many of the people who intersected with the case, whether as suspects, witnesses, or investigators, died prematurely, sometimes under questionable circumstances. Journalist Dorothy Kilgallen, who had conducted a rare interview with Jack Ruby and promised to reveal explosive information, was found dead in her Manhattan apartment in 1965, her notes missing. Officially, the cause was an overdose, but her death has long raised eyebrows. The Kennedy family, for their part, remained mostly silent on the deeper questions of JFK's death. But over time, cracks formed in the public facade. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., now a prominent public figure in his own right, has repeatedly suggested that he believes his uncle's death involved more than just Oswald. "The evidence is overwhelming that the CIA was involved," he said in a 2018 interview. His father, Robert F. Kennedy Sr., who was assassinated in 1968 under similarly murky circumstances, reportedly never believed the lone gunman theory either. For the Kennedy family, the twin assassinations of JFK and RFK have long symbolized a broader theft, not just of lives, but of a vision for the country. The dream of a more peaceful, less militarized foreign policy. A freer, more transparent government. That dream, many feel, died not with the brothers themselves, but with the failure to hold accountable those who might have benefited from their deaths. And here is where the declassified files take on their most powerful meaning, not as a smoking gun or final answer, but as a ledger of missed opportunities. The records show how warnings went ignored, how truth was obscured, and how fear over institutional embarrassment took precedence over justice. Take the FBI memo dated November 17, 1963, 5 days before the assassination. It warned the Secret Service that Lee Harvey Oswald posed a potential threat to the president. The memo specifically flagged Oswald's erratic behavior, his defection to the USSR, and his apparent obsession with pro-Castro ideology. Yet there was no change to the Dallas security arrangements. No elevation of threat level. No attempt to locate Oswald, despite his presence in the same city Kennedy would visit. Even after the assassination, the FBI continued shaping the narrative. Declassified memos reveal that Director J. Edgar Hoover was deeply concerned about public perception. "The thing I am concerned about," he wrote the day after Kennedy's death, "is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin." That line, buried in bureaucratic language, encapsulates the approach, managing belief rather than uncovering fact. And it worked, at least for a while. But the cracks widened. And with each new file came fresh questions. Why did the CIA destroy surveillance tapes of Oswald in Mexico City? Why did the FBI suppress witness statements suggesting multiple shooters? Why did Secret Service agents violate protocol by cleaning out the president's limousine before a full forensic investigation? The answer, the files suggest, is not always sinister, but it is institutional. Agencies sought to protect their methods, their reputations, their funding. The result was a fragmented investigation, full of silos and secrets, incapable of delivering closure. By the time the Assassination Records Review Board, ARRB, was formed in the 1990s to oversee the release of JFK documents, the sense of urgency had faded. But the ARRB's work laid the groundwork for what came later. The board uncovered shocking details, like the fact that JFK's brain, preserved for autopsy, had mysteriously disappeared, or that certain autopsy photos were missing or substituted, or that medical staff at Parkland Hospital, where Kennedy was taken immediately after being shot, described a large wound in the back of his head, suggesting a shot from the front, contrary to the official trajectory. These weren't amateur conspiracy theorists making wild claims. These were doctors, nurses, military officials, and federal investigators, many of whom spoke publicly for the first time only decades later, after retiring from service. As more of these voices emerged, a new picture formed, not of a neat execution by a shadowy cabal, but of a systemic failure, riddled with motives, missteps, and opportunism. If Oswald acted alone, he did so under circumstances that remained bizarrely compromised. If he didn't, then those who helped him, directly or indirectly, were shielded by layers of bureaucracy and misdirection. Either way, the American people were denied a full accounting. And the question lingers, would the truth, had it been known, have changed the course of history? Would Vietnam have escalated so swiftly? Would Nixon's rise have happened the same way? Would the cynicism that defines modern American politics have taken root without that original trauma? We may never know. But as the records continue to surface, a collective reckoning grows closer. The past cannot be changed, but it can be understood. And in that understanding, there is power. Power to recognize the signs of corruption, to demand transparency, and to protect the ideals that were buried, however briefly, in Dealey Plaza. As more records surfaced, a fascinating through line became apparent. Many of the threads surrounding Kennedy's assassination tied back not just to Cuba or the Cold War, but to a broader internal war within the United States government, a silent struggle between elected officials and entrenched power structures that had long operated in the shadows. One of the most chilling revelations to emerge from the declassified documents involved the CIA's counterintelligence chief, James Jesus Angleton. Known for his paranoia and secrecy, Angleton ran an elite division tasked with identifying foreign moles and safeguarding the agency's deepest operations. He was also the man responsible for maintaining the CIA's file on Lee Harvey Oswald. That file, it turns out, was far more detailed than previously known. Documents reveal that the agency had been tracking Oswald since his defection to the Soviet Union in 1959 and even monitored his activities after his return to the U.S. in 1962. What was most startling wasn't that they had a file on Oswald. It was the degree to which they withheld it from other agencies, even as he moved closer to Kennedy in both geography and behavior. In October 1963, just a month before the assassination, Oswald traveled to Mexico City and visited both the Cuban and Soviet embassies. The CIA had the city under heavy surveillance, including phone taps and photographic monitoring. However, the photos taken of the man identified as Oswald didn't actually resemble him. This discrepancy was buried in classified files for decades. When later confronted, the CIA claimed it must have been a mistaken identity, though skeptics believe it suggests a possible impersonation, or worse, a deliberate operation to create confusion. What could explain this strange, muddy trail? One theory, now supported by documents and sworn testimony, posits that Oswald may have been used, either knowingly or unknowingly, as part of a larger intelligence operation. In this theory, he was manipulated into actions that would later implicate him, thereby providing a cover story for something more complex. This aligns with revelations from George Jones, a CIA officer who in 1963 was the liaison to anti-Castro Cuban exile groups in New Orleans and Dallas, groups that Oswald had both clashed with and appeared to support, in what some have called controlled opposition. Jones' full role was hidden from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, in the 1970s. Only decades later did researchers learn he had been brought out of retirement to act as the CIA's point man during the investigation, without disclosing his direct connection to the very people being investigated. This deliberate obstruction prompted the ARRB to describe the CIA's behavior as a material breach of cooperation. In any other investigation, such a revelation would have been seismic. In the Kennedy case, it was just another brick in the wall of silence. And it wasn't just the CIA. The Secret Service, whose job it was to protect the president, destroyed key documents in the days after the assassination. One such document was a trip itinerary listing all personnel assigned to Kennedy's motorcade, an essential tool for cross-referencing positions, movements, and responsibilities. Despite explicit orders to preserve all records, it was shredded. No satisfactory explanation was given. The FBI, meanwhile, engaged in its own cleanup. When agents visited the home of Oswald's widow, Marina, they reportedly took possession of letters, photographs, and even her diary, many of which were never returned or properly cataloged. An internal memo from Hoover reveals that the agency feared an outburst of public hysteria if it became known how much surveillance they had on Oswald and how little they had done to intervene. Over time, this pattern of obfuscation created a deep distrust, not just of the JFK narrative, but of all government accounts that followed. Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11, the Iraq War, Snowden's revelations. Each became linked in the public psyche, not because they were connected, but because they shared the same DNA: secrecy, denial, and damage control. For historians, this created a secondary challenge. The Kennedy assassination was no longer just a moment in time. It was the foundation of an entire genre of American cynicism. It birthed a modern consciousness that asked, again and again, what aren't they telling us? In that context, the 2017 and 2018 document releases were more than just historical events. They were part of an ongoing tug-of-war between truth and narrative, between institutional memory and public transparency. And for those who had spent their lives chasing the truth, journalists, whistleblowers, citizen researchers, it was a moment of both vindication and frustration. Among the newly declassified files was a set of cables showing that U.S. intelligence officials had been warned by foreign governments that Kennedy's death was likely to spark instability and possibly even nuclear conflict. One Soviet assessment, shared through diplomatic back channels, expressed fear that a fascist military coup had taken place in America and that hardliners were poised to blame Moscow as a pretext for war. The KGB reportedly entered a state of high alert, fearing that Khrushchev would be blamed and that retaliation might be imminent. British intelligence, meanwhile, noted an unusual spike in U.S. military communications in Europe immediately after the assassination, interpreted by some analysts as a signal that NATO forces were bracing for a wider confrontation. These details, while not proof of conspiracy, underscore how volatile the moment truly was, and how carefully the U.S. government worked to project calm even as internal systems faltered. Another revelation was the continued resistance to transparency from modern administrations. While President Trump released a large tranche of documents in 2017, he withheld hundreds of others at the last minute. His justification: national security concerns. President Biden continued this approach, delaying full release into the mid-2020s. What exactly is still being protected 60 years later? Some believe the unreleased files pertain to operations that are still classified for unrelated reasons, like sources and methods of surveillance, or relationships with foreign governments that remain sensitive. Others argue more directly. The files implicate people or agencies in ways that would fundamentally damage public trust. Among the most protected documents are those relating to CIA assets and operations in Cuba and Mexico, and internal communications between high-level U.S. intelligence officers in the weeks before and after the assassination. Several researchers believe that buried in those memos lies the closest thing we have to an answer: a smoking gun, or at least a smoldering one. But even without that final confirmation, the outline of the story has become clearer. President Kennedy was a man at odds with the machinery of war, intelligence, and covert influence. He sought détente with the Soviet Union, refused to invade Cuba, resisted pressure to escalate in Vietnam, and tried to reduce the nuclear arms race. In doing so, he made powerful enemies, not in the ideological sense, but in the institutional one. He represented a pivot toward transparency and restraint at a time when hidden power was accustomed to unchecked authority. And in the end, that may have cost him his life. Whether the trigger was pulled by a lone gunman or as part of a larger plan, the aftermath was shaped by those who stood to benefit. And the story told to the public was not the whole truth. As the 60th anniversary of his death passed in 2023, Americans reflected not just on the man lost, but on the moment that marked a fracture in national identity. A loss of innocence, a beginning of doubt. And as more files become public, some through lawsuits, others through eventual declassification, the work continues. Not to prove one theory over another, but to reclaim history from the shadows and restore faith in the pursuit of truth. In the final pages of the story, written not by authors, but by archivists, researchers, and ordinary citizens determined to see history clearly, a complicated truth emerges. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was not merely a singular crime. It was a prism through which the American people saw, perhaps for the first time, the limits of transparency in their democracy. The legacy of that November day in 1963 is still evolving. With each new declassified document, we inch closer not only to understanding the crime itself, but to confronting the way institutions manage truth, fear, and power. One of the last sets of documents released in 2022 included a detailed internal CIA analysis dated years after the assassination, reflecting on the agency's role in managing public perception. It outlined how certain documents had been withheld from the Warren Commission for the sake of national cohesion, and how information that could create diplomatic incidents, such as CIA ties to Cuban exile groups, was intentionally obfuscated. Another document revealed internal debates over the autopsy. Initially performed under military supervision at Bethesda Naval Hospital, JFK's autopsy has long been criticized for its irregularities. Parkland Hospital physicians in Dallas, who first treated Kennedy, recalled a large exit wound in the back of the president's head, suggesting a frontal shot. But the official autopsy later described a different trajectory, supporting the lone gunman theory. Declassified memos show officials discussing the need to control the narrative to avoid national panic and maintain foreign confidence in U.S. stability. This concept, control the narrative, reverberates through many of the remaining redacted files. It speaks not to the orchestration of the murder itself, perhaps, but to the orchestration of its interpretation. In other words, even if Lee Harvey Oswald fired the fatal shot, it is what happened after the shot that changed America. The effect of this control was psychological. The Warren Commission, meant to bring closure, instead sowed suspicion. The HSCA, intended as a corrective, only confirmed what many suspected, that the government had not told the full truth. And the ARRB, operating decades later, discovered that critical pieces of evidence were still missing, altered, or sealed under executive privilege. The long-term impact has been corrosive. Polls consistently show that most Americans do not believe the official version of JFK's assassination. This has fostered not just a cottage industry of conspiracy theories, but a broader disillusionment with the idea that public institutions are capable of self-policing. This disillusionment found new expressions in the generations that followed. Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra, the Iraq War, the Snowden leaks. In every scandal, the JFK assassination loomed in the background, not because each was connected to it, but because they all shared a common theme: deception cloaked in patriotism. For some, the assassination has become more than a historical event. It is a symbol. It represents a point of divergence in American history, the end of one trajectory, the beginning of another. What might Kennedy have done had he lived? Would he have withdrawn fully from Vietnam, as some of his aides later claimed he intended? Would he have succeeded in nuclear disarmament negotiations with the Soviet Union? Would he have dismantled or restructured the CIA, as he reportedly threatened after the Bay of Pigs fiasco? We can only speculate. But the potential itself is part of the tragedy, the sense of promise interrupted. To understand this impact, we must look beyond the corridors of power. Across the country, generations of Americans have grown up in the shadow of Dealey Plaza. Some remember exactly where they were when the shots rang out. Others know it only through grainy footage and endless documentaries. Yet all feel its resonance. It is one of the few moments in American life that transcends politics and ideology, because it speaks to something deeper, our collective vulnerability. Even as files continue to trickle out, there is little hope for a final smoking gun. Whatever the full truth was, it has long since been buried under layers of misdirection, missing evidence, and institutional self-preservation. But that does not mean the search has been in vain. Every new file, every clarified detail, contributes to a more accurate mosaic. It allows us to identify what went wrong, not just in Dallas, but in Washington, in Langley, in the halls of the FBI, and the basements of military installations where evidence was stored, modified, or lost. The story of JFK's assassination is no longer just a matter of who pulled the trigger. It is about the system that responded to that crisis, and how that response defined the future of American governance. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that in moments of tragedy, the truth is often not destroyed, but hidden, preserved behind stamps of classified, behind redactions and omissions, behind legal loopholes and national security clauses. But truth, like memory, has a stubborn resilience. It waits, and sometimes it returns, not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper, barely audible between the lines of a once secret memo. Now, more than 6 decades later, the American public remains engaged in the quiet, patient act of listening. Listening to the documents, to the testimony of doctors, agents, journalists, and bystanders, to the contradictions, to the silence, to the refusal, still, to let the curtain close entirely. And maybe that's what justice looks like. Not a sudden revelation, not even full consensus, but persistence. The continued demand for accountability, no matter how long it takes. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy was, and remains, a defining wound in the American psyche. But in its aftermath, a different kind of patriotism emerged, one rooted not in blind trust, but in vigilance. A belief that the government is not the keeper of truth, but its steward. A belief that no document should remain hidden forever. A belief that the past belongs to the people. And in that belief, the story of JFK's death finds its final meaning, not in conspiracy, but in courage. Not in silence, but in search. Not in secrecy, but in light. The light of documents unsealed. The light of history reclaimed. The light of a people still asking, still watching, and still refusing to look away.